luxurious restaurant glowed under the crystal chandeliers, each table draped in pristine white linen, red wine swirling in exquisite crystal glasses. The ambiance exuded the essence of the elite, where every glance, every word carried an underlying meaning. Guests dressed in elegant, sophisticated attire were enjoying their evening in peace, until an unexpected event shattered the perfect atmosphere. Rachel Carter, a beautiful waitress with lustrous brown hair tied in a high bun, swiftly moved through the tables, her expression radiating confidence with a hint of arrogance. She was not just any ordinary employee. Her decisive work ethic earned her the respect of her colleagues, but she was equally notorious for her disdain toward guests she deemed unworthy. And tonight, Rachel's eyes landed on a particular figure, a man dressed simply in faded jeans and a plain shirt, completely out of place in this lavish setting. He carried himself with calm composure, his face unreadable, yet his gaze held a quiet strength. Though he did not stand out like the other guests, his presence had an inexplicable pull. Rachel narrowed her eyes, scrutinizing him from head to toe with an expression of disdain. She set down her tray with just enough force to make a subtle noise, drawing the attention of nearby patrons. "It seems there's been a mistake," Rachel said coldly, her lips curling slightly with contempt. "We don't usually serve guests without reservations." The man lifted his gaze to her, his eyes sharp yet composed. "I made a reservation. Perhaps you should check again." Rachel smirked, her gaze sweeping over him with clear derision. "Oh, really? But honestly, I don't think you belong here. This is a restaurant for the elite. Not just anyone can walk in." She spoke with deliberate emphasis, ensuring those around could hear. A murmur spread through the restaurant. Curious eyes turned toward the man, anticipating his reaction, but he remained composed, not angered, merely observing Rachel in silence. Unsettled by his lack of response, Rachel let out a dry chuckle and deliberately poured a glass of red wine slowly. Instead of placing it neatly before him, she slid the glass across the table, making the liquid ripple dangerously close to spilling over. "You don't mind if I serve you in my own way, do you?" she challenged, her eyes gleaming with provocation. The man rested his hand on the table, his gaze sharpening. He wasn't accustomed to being treated this way, yet he had no intention of causing a scene. Tilting his head slightly, he spoke in a deep, steady voice. "Do you know what you're doing?" Rachel crossed her arms over her chest, her smirk deepening with arrogance. "I'm simply ensuring this restaurant serves the right kind of guests, those with real class." The air grew suffocatingly tense. Guests began whispering among themselves, while a few staff members exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared to intervene in this confrontation. Then, without warning, the man stood up, his eyes as sharp as a blade. In an instant, the fragile silence was shattered, not by him, but by Rachel. She suddenly swung her hand, pushing the glass of wine toward him with unnecessary force. The deep crimson liquid spilled across the table, streaking the white cloth like blood. A gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by an eerie silence. The man raised an eyebrow, unfazed, but his expression shifted. His patience seemed to have reached its limit. He leaned down, dabbing at the wine stain with a napkin before locking eyes with Rachel, his voice low and commanding. "You just made a serious mistake." Rachel hesitated for a fraction of a second, but quickly regained her composure. "Oh, really? And should I be worried about that?" At that moment, the restaurant manager, a middle-aged man in a dark suit, hurried over. His face betrayed his discomfort, though he struggled to maintain composure as he glanced at the man before turning to Rachel. "Rachel, what's going on here?" The man said nothing more. He simply straightened his posture, pulled his phone from his pocket, dialed a number, and pressed it to his ear. "I believe your restaurant is due for a thorough review of its service quality," he said evenly, though a glint of cold authority flashed in his eyes, sending a rare wave of unease through Rachel. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Rachel, who had always been confident and in control, suddenly found herself teetering on the edge of a precarious mistake. The stares from those around her were no longer approving. They were scrutinizing, judgmental. She had no idea what was about to happen, but one thing was certain. Tonight would not end the way she had imagined, and this was only the beginning of a night filled with unforeseen events. where everything could change in ways no one could predict. In the gentle evening light, the luxurious city restaurant shimmered under the glow of dazzling crystal chandeliers, creating a magnificent atmosphere where every detail was meticulously crafted. The tables were draped in pristine white linens, interspersed with flickering candlelight, and the rich aroma of wine infused the air with an air of elegance, painting a vivid picture of sophistication and refinement. Within this space, amidst the soft murmurs of diners and the rhythmic footsteps of the staff, life seemed to flow with a sense of peace and perfectly arranged order. Amidst this setting, Rachel Carter, a beautiful waitress with sleek, chestnut-brown hair neatly tied up, appeared with a confident demeanor, exuding the professionalism she took pride in. However, beneath her polished exterior, Rachel's gaze held an undeniable arrogance, a self-importance nurtured by years of working in the high-end service industry. She judged customers by their appearance, believing herself capable of discerning a person's status with just a glance. And tonight, as her eyes fell upon a seemingly ordinary guest, a wave of self-satisfied contempt rose within her. That man was David Beckham, a symbol of elegance, success, and class. Despite his simple attire, a minimalist suit, and a composed expression, David radiated an inner strength that was rare to find. He entered the restaurant with an effortless grace, neither rushed nor hesitant, exuding quiet confidence in every step. Yet to Rachel, David was just another unremarkable guest, unworthy of her attention. She had no idea that beneath his understated appearance, he was the owner of the very establishment, the man who had laid the foundation for the pride of the city's elite. Rachel approached David's table with poised steps, but within her, a dismissive attitude had already taken root. She bowed slightly, her voice carrying an undertone of mockery disguised as politeness as she asked, "Good evening, sir. Are you dining alone, or will someone be joining you?" Her tone rang with challenge, a veiled sarcasm behind her courteous smile. David slowly lifted his gaze, his expression calm yet carrying a piercing sharpness. He replied in a deep, steady voice, "I'd like a table by the window." His words resonated in the quiet space of the restaurant, a subtle affirmation that truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how obscured by external perceptions. Rachel's lips curled into a faint smirk, her gaze sweeping over David with unmistakable condescension. She responded, "I'm afraid that section is fully reserved. You may take a seat at the corner table instead." Her voice emphasized the divide between those deemed worthy and those who, in her judgment, did not belong among the upper echelon, further thickening the tense atmosphere. In that moment, surrounding diners fell silent, their eyes drawn to Rachel, as if anticipating a confrontation between arrogance and truth. David nodded quietly, accepting the seat without protest. Meanwhile, Rachel returned to her duties, maintaining her usual self-assured air. However, deep inside, an unsettling sensation stirred. She swiftly attended to other guests, those adorned in designer labels, those who carried an aura of wealth and prestige, offering them radiant smiles, reverent glances, and the meticulously trained professionalism she had perfected over the years. Yet her eyes never strayed far from David, subtly tracking every move of the man she had deemed unworthy. As the evening unfolded, the restaurant retained its refined elegance. The soft glow of the chandeliers reflected on polished surfaces, painting an intricate portrait of unspoken emotions and hidden tensions. David, composed and enigmatic, remained the silent focal point of the room, drawing subtle attention from the other guests. He savored his wine with an unhurried grace, his gaze observant yet unreadable, as if reminding the world that no amount of external judgment could suppress the truth. Then, at a particular moment, a senior staff member approached David's table, bowing respectfully. His voice carried the distinct reverence reserved for the elite. "Good evening, Mr. Beckham. It is an honor to have you dining with us tonight. We have prepared a private VIP section exclusively for you." The words sent a ripple through the room, a quiet but undeniable shock spreading among the guests. Silence fell, And in that instant, Rachel stood frozen, her heartbeat accelerating, her face gradually draining of color. She could not believe what she had just heard. The image of the ordinary customer in her mind shattered completely in the face of the unveiled truth. David remained composed, yet his gaze sharpened as he looked at Rachel. With an almost imperceptible smirk, he responded calmly, "I think this table will do just fine." His voice, though soft, carried an unmistakable weight, a statement requiring no further elaboration. The air in the restaurant grew heavy, filled with hushed whispers as diners tried to grasp the sudden shift in atmosphere. The scrutinizing gazes came not only from the regular patrons, but also from the staff, who had long witnessed Rachel's unshakable confidence. Now, they sensed the imbalance in her demeanor. The woman who once prided herself on her ability to gauge people's status had been undone by her own arrogance. David's quiet, yet piercing presence, his firm and unyielding gaze, painted a new reality, a revelation of truth that could no longer be concealed by superficial judgments. In that moment, Rachel felt as if a wound had been exposed within her, a wound she had never acknowledged until now. She struggled to maintain her composed facade, but each drop of cold sweat, each shallow breath, betrayed the turmoil within. She stammered, attempting to find words to justify her actions, but no apology could undo the mistake she had made. David's voice, steady and resolute, cut through the silence. "It's fascinating to see how a staff member assesses a guest based solely on appearance. Perhaps the most important quality in the service industry is respect, not judgment." In that moment, Rachel felt as if a wound had been exposed within her, a wound she had never acknowledged until now. She struggled to maintain her composed facade, but each drop of cold sweat, each shallow breath, betrayed the turmoil within. She stammered, attempting to find words to justify her actions, but no apology could undo the mistake she had made. David's voice, steady and resolute, cut through the silence. "It's fascinating to see how a staff member assesses a guest based solely on appearance. Perhaps the most important quality in the service industry is respect, not judgment." His words echoed like a resonant chime of truth, slicing through the layers of arrogance and prejudice. The atmosphere in the restaurant grew denser as each person, in their own way, reflected upon the genuine values that define a person. Whispers spread, eyes exchanged glances filled with a mixture of sympathy and silent judgment, reinforcing the undeniable reality: truth could never remain hidden forever. Rachel stood motionless, her gaze lost in confusion, unable to meet David's eyes. The pride and confidence she had carried for years began to erode, replaced by a profound sense of regret. She realized that the beliefs she had built her world upon were nothing more than fragile illusions, easily shattered when faced with undeniable reality. The overwhelming silence of the room deepened her turmoil, each passing second serving as a reminder that a person's worth could never be measured by mere appearances. David remained seated, sipping his wine with unhurried ease, his gaze quietly observing Rachel's every move. He did not need to say more. He knew that truth speaks for itself through actions and emotions. In his eyes lay an unwavering conviction that, despite mistakes, despite biases and judgments, people could always rediscover their true value if they chose to listen to the voice of their heart. He believed that only respect and kindness could bring about lasting change in the world. The restaurant, once a haven of unshaken elegance, had transformed into a silent stage where the interplay of pride and truth unfolded. From Rachel's arrogance to David's quiet strength, from the hushed whispers of guests to the wary glances of the staff, every element of the evening wove together into a poignant tapestry of emotions, one filled with conflict, yet undeniably profound. As the dinner drew to a close, David remained there, a man who had weathered life's storms, unwavering in his belief in truth and genuine values. He did not need to explain it in words. His presence alone conveyed it all. And Rachel, standing at a distance, her heart weighed down by regret, carried a newfound sliver of hope that from this night forward, she could learn a valuable lesson in humility and respect. As time stretched on, the last footsteps echoed across the polished floors, and the restaurant's soft glow faded into the night. But the events of this evening remained deeply etched in the minds of all who had witnessed them. A story of the inevitable clash between arrogance and truth, between a persona shaped by external judgments and the unshakable essence of inner worth. In the opulent restaurant, following the turmoil sparked by Rachel's insults, the atmosphere subtly shifted into a realm of quiet suspicion. The restaurant staff, once accustomed to the orderly rhythm of their work, now displayed their unease through fleeting glances and silent gestures as Rachel continued to exude her arrogance, oblivious to the fact that her reckless actions were gradually painting a picture of an undisclosed truth. The employees exchanged contemplative looks, as if they had begun to perceive an unsettling anomaly in the relationship between her and the man she had just insulted. Those glances, laden with apprehension and caution, rippled through every corner of the restaurant. The air grew thick with an oppressive silence, interrupted only by the indistinct murmurs of nearby patrons. A few waiters behind the bar clutched their glasses with trembling hands, trying to mask their anxiety as they witnessed a scene too daunting to face directly. They understood that in the world of prestige and decorum, every action, every word, could trigger a chain of unforeseeable consequences. Even the smallest signs, an uncertain gaze, a slight nod of agreement with the prevailing unease, hinted that anyone paying close attention could sense that the situation between Rachel and the man was veering toward an unfavorable turn. Among the crowd of guests enjoying their meals, a few exchanged quiet glances filled with curiosity. Some, upon hearing the name David Beckham, could not help but recognize the figure before them. Yet none dared to intervene or voice their realization. Instead, they merely observed in silence, their expressions a mix of confusion, disappointment, and a trace of intrigue. Their eyes seemed to convey a silent message, that no matter how well a truth is concealed, it will inevitably reveal itself through actions and gestures. The tension in the restaurant mounted to a point where every laugh and every conversation grew shorter, replaced by moments of heavy silence, as though everyone was bracing for an impending revelation. Rachel, still indulging in her self-assured arrogance, continued to flaunt her perceived superiority through sarcastic remarks and unapologetic actions. She remained utterly unaware that, in that very moment, she was making a grave mistake. Each of her gestures, every thoughtless word, was like a puzzle piece assembling the greater image of a truth long kept hidden. She failed to realize that beneath the restaurant's dazzling lights, her hostility and pride were slowly fracturing the fragile space of trust and respect. The guests around her could sense the disturbance, yet none dared to intervene. In a world where class and status dictated every movement, each action carried a significance no one could ignore. Meanwhile, David Beckham, the man who had been enduring the insults with remarkable composure, maintained the bearing of a formidable businessman. Though his eyes grew colder, he refrained from reacting rashly. Instead, he allowed the moment to unfold naturally, as if harboring a secret so profound that only time could unveil it. His gaze upon Rachel carried both sorrow and disappointment, yet also a sense of acceptance, as though he had long anticipated this scenario. In that instant, he resembled a statue of resilience amidst an emotional storm, betraying no internal turmoil despite Rachel's words cutting through the fragile threads of respect and dignity. The restaurant, meticulously designed for sophistication, now found itself entangled in tension. The hushed whispers, the furtive glances of the guests, and the worried gestures of the staff all wove together into a symphony of unease and uncertainty. Everyone in the room could sense that tonight, a great mystery was about to unravel, a truth no one had anticipated encountering. The smallest signs, the way an employee looked at another, the hesitant tone of a patron's voice, the eerie silence that thickened the air, all painted a larger picture of an impending revelation. Amidst the stifling tension, Rachel remained unchanged in her demeanor. She continued basking in her own self-importance, utterly oblivious that her thoughtless actions were cementing the foundation of an unfolding tragedy she would soon have to confront. If anything, she grew even more brazen, as though her arrogance could shield her from all mistakes. However, the The gazes of those around her, both guests and staff alike, seemed to deliver a silent warning. The truth will never remain buried forever. As the air grew heavier with anticipation, the soft sound of footsteps echoed through the restaurant, a subtle yet undeniable signal that nothing would remain the same after tonight. A waitress moved swiftly down the hallway, her eyes locked on Rachel, while others continued exchanging weighted glances. The fragments of truth, seen in the staff's nervousness, the guests' silent stares, were gradually coalescing into a larger revelation, one that promised an unpredictable night where every passing second carried the weight of inevitable change. David Beckham, having carefully observed the accumulating signs, slowly rose from his seat. He maintained his usual composure, yet his eyes now held an undeniable sharpness, a severity that few dared to meet. He stepped toward Rachel, not with harsh words or impulsive gestures, but with a silence so powerful it carried the weight of an unspoken verdict. The truth will be revealed. Every step he took bore the gravity of the past, of decisions made, and of lessons that time could never erase. In that moment, his eyes met Rachel's, and the entire space seemed to contract into a suffocating silence. His gaze, cold as ice yet laden with meaning, delivered an unspoken message. No matter how many layers of arrogance and deceit one hides behind, the truth will ultimately emerge. Rachel, once so smug and self-assured, now felt the first tremors of unease creeping into her soul, a flicker of anxiety slipping through the hardened walls of her confidence. The guests, the staff, and even the very essence of the restaurant seemed to fall into stillness, awaiting the moment when the great truth would finally surface. Every second stretched on, as though time itself sought to etch each passing moment into history, a story unfolding in real time that no one dared believe had a conclusion. The witnesses remained silent, knowing that in this precise moment, every movement, every gesture, carried a depth of meaning beyond what words could ever convey. The atmosphere in the restaurant was still thick with tension and uncertainty when an unexpected turning point was about to unfold, as if fate itself was ready to lift the veil on a monumental secret. Just as Rachel remained lost in her self-satisfaction and arrogance, the restaurant manager suddenly appeared. His face was weary, beads of cold sweat glistened on his forehead, and his eyes betrayed unmistakable panic. He stepped into the crowd with the look of a man who had just witnessed something no one had anticipated. Approaching hesitantly, his hands trembled as he clutched his phone and a stack of documents, his gaze fixed anxiously on Rachel's every movement, unable to mask his growing dread. In that instant, when the manager realized that the man Rachel had just insulted was not an ordinary guest but the actual owner of the restaurant, a symbol of power and prestige, everything suddenly became far more grave. He stood amid the crowd, his face a mix of bewilderment and fear, knowing that Rachel's mistake was not merely a personal misstep, but one that had dealt a serious blow to the restaurant's entire reputation. His frantic demeanor, the way he clutched his phone, his eyes darting for support from those around him, all foreshadowed an impending reckoning, one where status and truth would inevitably take control. Meanwhile, David Beckham maintained the composed demeanor of a seasoned businessman. He stood under the dim glow of the restaurant's lighting, his sharp gaze as cutting as a blade, exuding an air of authority and inner strength. Though he had been disrespected by Rachel's thoughtless words, he did not react impulsively. Instead, he remained silent, observing, as if calculating everything within his mind. Every gesture of his radiated composure, yet within it lay a resolute force, a silent assertion that true power does not need to be flaunted, but merely exists, undeniable in its quiet presence. As the restaurant manager attempted to restore order, the sighs and hushed whispers of the customers only thickened the stifling air. David, standing there with his unwavering gaze, looked at Rachel with silent yet undeniable judgment, as if to say, "You have made an unforgivable mistake." Every step he took, every measured breath, seemed to affirm an inevitable truth, that no matter how deeply buried beneath arrogance, Reality would always find a way to surface, and no one could escape it. Rachel, sensing the manager's presence and the icy gaze of David upon her, began to lose the confidence she had once taken pride in. She stood frozen, her vision blurred, her lips trembling, and her voice faltering. The arrogance she had once cherished now crumbled into regret and dismay, as if she had unknowingly walked into a labyrinth with no way out. Inside her, fear and anxiety intertwined with overwhelming remorse, like a storm raging beyond control. The manager, his voice quivering but firm with responsibility, solemnly asked, "Rachel, what exactly happened here?" His words echoed in the hushed space, an invitation for the truth to be spoken. But Rachel could only lower her gaze, unable to answer. At that moment, she realized that everything she had built upon self-importance and arrogance was now collapsing entirely. The eyes of the customers, witnesses to the scene, lingered on her, silently demanding an explanation from the woman they had once admired for her confidence and poise, yet who now stood before them, fragile beyond belief. David, after hearing the manager's voice, remained silent, yet his gaze grew even colder. He steadied himself, and in that profound moment of stillness, the weight of the atmosphere pressed down, leaving only the sound of hushed breaths and the rapid heartbeats of those unable to conceal their unease. David's eyes, though he spoke no words, conveyed everything: power, acknowledgement, and an unyielding stance in the face of human folly. The diners, though they remained voiceless, exchanged knowing glances. They understood that within the seemingly small details of tonight's events, a much greater truth was being unveiled. The way David confronted Rachel's actions, the way the manager arrived with visible distress, and the way the staff subtly masked their own fears, all painted a complex picture of pride, arrogance, and a reality that seeped into every passing second. Within this charged moment, David calmly lowered his head, took the manager's phone in his hand, dialed a number, and, in a voice that was both poised and commanding, said, "I believe this restaurant needs to be reevaluated." His words cut through the tense air like a razor, leaving the room in stunned silence. The manager cast his eyes downward, while Rachel, her face vacant and her lips quivering, slowly began to grasp that not only had she personally erred, but she had also shattered the trust of those around her through a mistake she could never undo. In that moment, the gleaming crystal chandeliers cast their glow upon David's face, highlighting the firm resolve and unshakable authority of a true businessman. Though he had endured insult and disrespect, he remained unwavering, leaving a lasting impression of undeniable power that required no further explanation. His gaze alone declared that no matter how deeply arrogance attempted to bury wrongdoing, the truth would always rise to the surface. The energy in the restaurant seemed to slow, breaths mingling with the hesitant footsteps of the staff. Rachel, standing at the eye of the emotional storm, was no longer the confident waitress she had once been. Now, she was but a shadow of her former arrogance, standing quietly, her glistening eyes betraying the silent tears of regret. Within her, the pride and confidence she had carried for so long melted away under the weight of the truth's voice, leaving her lost, unsure of how to reclaim the identity she had once believed in. Each passing second in that space stretched into eternity, as if every emotion, every worry, and every unease condensed into the moment. The gazes of the customers, the whispered exchanges of the staff, all wove together a symphony of truth and life lessons. David, steady and unwavering, never once shifted his eyes from Rachel, standing as both a figure of authority and quiet benevolence, bearing witness to it all, knowing that only truth could heal wounds, and only understanding could soften pain. As the night continued, the story of arrogance and truth, of insults and silent retribution, gradually closed another chapter in each person's life. But though tonight's events might fade into mere memory, they would leave an indelible mark, an unspoken lesson that words could never fully encapsulate. The appearance of the manager, David's simple yet commanding words, and Rachel's undeniable regret had all become inextricable pieces of a larger picture. a picture in which the truth, no matter how concealed, would always find its way to the surface. As the last footsteps echoed and the night drew to an end, the echoes of the evening's events lingered in the hearts of all who had borne witness. It stood as a reminder that in life, only truth and respect could allow one to truly live with integrity. The tension in the restaurant slowly dissipated, but the imprints of truth had been etched deeply into the minds of those present, a silent vow that no matter how grave a mistake, it would always demand its due reckoning. In the grandeur of the luxurious restaurant, where crystal chandeliers shimmered and reflected every intricate detail of the pristine white tablecloths, the atmosphere slowly shifted in tune with the unspoken emotions beneath. After the recent turmoil, everything seemed to change in an instant. The staff, once accustomed to the order, elegance, and refinement of their work, now exchanged wary glances, their subtle gestures and hushed whispers spreading like an undercurrent through the vast space of the restaurant. A sense of unease seeped from the hidden corners, stretching from the lavish tables to the narrow hallways, as if silently heralding the approach of something unsettling. Rachel, once known for her unwavering arrogance and confidence, began to sense the shifting dynamics around her. Every time she passed through the corridors, the eyes of her colleagues and fellow waitstaff carried an unspoken wariness, a mixture of caution and fear. In every smile, in every unspoken gesture, she detected a subtle change. Respect had been replaced with hesitation, doubt, and apprehension. She couldn't comprehend why their attitudes had changed so drastically after the harsh words she had thrown at David. To her, those remarks were nothing more than a fleeting game, inconsequential and insignificant. Yet, gradually, she realized that the silence and anxious glances were not mere passive observations, but the prelude to a profound shift in reality itself. Meanwhile, David, embodying the composed demeanor of a man who had weathered countless storms, waged an internal battle he could not express. He felt that Rachel's actions were not just personal insults, but a direct challenge to professional ethics, values he had always upheld and protected. His heart wavered between two choices. Should he immediately confront Rachel, putting an end to her arrogance with decisive force, or should he take a measured approach, teaching her a lesson in humility and integrity through silent authority? With every passing second, he felt the storm within him intensify, a struggle between maintaining his composure and asserting the dignity that had been wrongfully challenged. With every glance and every movement, David questioned whether there was a way to quell his rising anger without betraying his calm exterior. He recalled life's harsh lessons, the painful yet meaningful experiences that had shaped him. Memories of the past, of those who had faced injustice and prejudice, echoed in his mind as a reminder that truth could be concealed only temporarily. It would always rise to the surface. He reminded himself not to let emotions dictate his actions, for sometimes silence and restraint carried more weight than the most cutting words. Beyond him, the eyes of the guests reflected a noticeable shift. Those who had once basked in the restaurant's warm and refined ambiance now bore expressions of quiet contemplation and concern. They understood that after what had transpired, nothing would be the same, no longer the perfect image they had once admired. They exchanged looks filled with unspoken questions, as if searching for a greater truth hidden within the unfolding details. Each individual carried their own thoughts, yet they all seemed to share a common sentiment. In this tense atmosphere, every action, every word, held a significance far beyond the surface. Meanwhile, Rachel continued moving through the vast space, still clinging to her characteristic arrogance. However, doubts had begun to creep into her mind, gnawing at her self-assured demeanor. She felt the slightest fracture within herself, as if her pride and confidence were being eroded by the whispers and scrutinizing gazes around her. In fleeting moments of solitude between her hurried steps, she found herself questioning whether she truly understood the value of respect, of compassion, or if she had merely lived according to the self-righteous image she had crafted. The change in the attitudes of those around her acted as a mirror, forcing her to confront a version of herself she had never wanted to acknowledge. David, still seated with an air of composed stillness, continued to watch Rachel's every movement. He remained silent, yet his gaze carried a weight of unspoken wisdom. He understood that in life's defining moments, only truth and patience could break through prejudice. He reminded himself that even in the face of reckless behavior, he must remain steadfast in his belief in sincerity and professional ethics. To him, every mistake was an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to reaffirm that dignity and truth would always prevail over insult and arrogance. The murmurs, the hushed sighs of the waitstaff, and the wary eyes of the guests blended into a symphony of emotions and fate. The silence resonated like a prophecy, that every wrongdoing would be answered for, that every prejudice would eventually be shattered by the weight of truth. The intensifying tension, David's internal conflict, and Rachel's evolving awareness wove together a complex emotional landscape, where pride, arrogance, and the true value of human character were being weighed on the scales of fate. Amidst the watchful gazes and whispered speculations, David resembled a silent warrior, caught in the storm of his own emotions, contemplating a crucial decision. Should he confront Rachel now, exposing the consequences of her actions, or should he allow events to unfold naturally, trusting that time itself would impart the lesson of professional integrity? His inner turmoil made every passing second unbearably heavy, as if time itself had been ensnared in the moment of decision. David recalled the lessons life had imparted, the stories of kindness and forgiveness, and he resolved that instead of reacting with the force that might further wound Rachel, he would use his composure to teach her the true meaning of respect and humility. He knew that sometimes silence and subtle gestures wielded greater power than the harshest reprimands, for they had the ability to reach the deepest recesses of the human soul. Suddenly, within the thick silence, the people around him seemed to edge closer, their expressions shifting from curiosity to astonishment and deepening concern. The footsteps of the staff mingled with the hushed murmurs of the guests, creating a discordant melody, an orchestration of fate. The entire restaurant seemed to come alive, as if waiting for the moment of reckoning to arrive. In Rachel's mind, a storm of conflicting thoughts surged. The once familiar warmth in the eyes of those around her had been replaced with judgment and doubt. The weight of their stares, the shift in their demeanor, all conveyed a silent yet undeniable truth, one she had yet to accept. David remained seated, his expression no longer merely calm, but resolute, commanding, and riddled with internal struggle. He was acutely aware that whatever action he took in this moment would shape the fate of both himself and Rachel, and he refused to let disrespect weaken his belief in the values of humanity and professional ethics. Every second felt prolonged, as if the entire space awaited a single decisive move, one that could shift the course of events entirely, erasing prejudices and affirming an unshakable truth. Within David's heart, the storm raged, yet he remained steadfast, refusing to allow anger to dictate his actions. He resolved that by imparting a lesson through restraint and dignity, Rachel would come to understand that in this world, truth always held the highest power, and that respect and ethics could never be compromised. He hoped that through each measured glance, through the weight of his silent presence, she would recognize her mistake and from that, gain the opportunity to grow. The tension stretched endlessly, saturating the restaurant's air with an unbearable heaviness. Every individual, be it staff or patron, could not help but feel the looming weight of fate in every breath they took. The silence spoke volumes, affirming that despite the conflict and internal battles, truth would ultimately surface, and human dignity would never be truly broken. In that suffocating moment, when the tension in the restaurant reached its peak, the atmosphere suddenly trembled with the hurried footsteps of the manager. The middle-aged man, his face drenched in sweat and his eyes filled with worry, moved toward the center of the space, where all eyes were now fixated on Rachel and David. He did not need to say much. His swift gestures and piercing gaze alone were enough to make everyone realize an earth-shattering truth they had never anticipated. David Beckham, the man they had assumed to be just an ordinary guest, was, in fact, the owner of the restaurant. The manager's voice rang out clearly, not laced with harsh reprimands but merely carrying the weight of truth. It was an announcement that allowed everyone to comprehend that Rachel's insult was not just a careless remark, but a grave mistake against the honor of an entire hierarchy of power. The gazes of both the staff and customers converged on David, not with admiration or mere curiosity, but with a mixture of reverence and fear. The truth was laid bare, stripping away all pretenses, turning the once warm atmosphere of the restaurant into something cold, heavy, and laden with judgment. Rachel stood at the eye of this emotional storm, speechless. She felt every scrutinizing glance, every piercing stare directed at her. In that instant, she was engulfed by the icy mist of truth, the very truth she had tried to mask with arrogance and reckless words. Her heart pounded violently, as if each beat resonated with the weight of her mistake. Shock and fear overwhelmed her eyes as she came to terms with the fact that everything she had once prided herself on was nothing more than a fragile shell, now shattered under the crushing force of reality. The manager, with a voice both gentle and authoritative, slowly delivered the words no one in the restaurant would ever forget. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to formally announce that David Beckham is not just a guest. He is the owner of this restaurant. Those words struck like thunder in the hushed air, plunging everyone into stunned disbelief. Customers and employees alike gaped in astonishment, their expressions laced with an unspoken gravity. Rachel, desperate to explain herself, grasped for words, but everything she said only deepened her own humiliation and confusion. In that moment, David maintained his usual composure, yet his gaze grew colder than ever, like lightning slicing through the air. He did not need to speak. His silence alone carried the message that, no matter how one is disrespected, the dignity of a person of true worth will always be upheld. He took a slow sip of wine, allowing the moment to stretch, ensuring that every onlooker understood that the truth, no matter how long it remained hidden, would always surface with undeniable force. Rachel stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, her face drained of all color from sheer shock. She tried to lift her hands, to convince everyone that this was all a misunderstanding, that she had never intended to offend someone of such stature. But her voice wavered, betraying the panic and shame that consumed her. Every word she uttered only served to thicken the suffocating air in the restaurant, as if her very attempt at justification was being crushed under the weight of the truth. The manager remained where he was, his gaze firm and resolute, conveying that in a world of refinement and prestige, there was no place for thoughtless behavior. He did not rush to scold Rachel. He let his words and the weight of reality do that for him. The entire restaurant sank into a silence thick with shock, where every gaze fell upon Rachel. The woman who once took pride in her arrogance, now reduced to fragments of a broken ego. At that moment, David slowly rose from his seat and walked toward Rachel with a demeanor both calm and imposing. His eyes met hers, silently conveying that, no matter what had happened, the value of truth and respect could never be forgotten. Gently, yet with undeniable authority, he placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes without a single word. It was not just a reminder of her place, but a lesson for everyone in the restaurant, a demonstration of true strength that did not require anger or retaliation, but simply presence. Soft murmurs and judgmental glances from the surrounding guests and staff echoed like the distant whisper of past lessons, of truths that time had reinforced. Rachel struggled to articulate an excuse, but her voice trembled even more, as though every syllable was swallowed by the immense weight of shame and fear. She knew, at that moment, that all attempts to conceal the truth were futile, that there was no escape from the judgment of the many eyes fixed upon her. David remained silent, his gaze unwavering, though within him a storm of emotions brewed. He reminded himself that sometimes the only way for someone to recognize their mistakes is to endure a moment of pain so raw and overwhelming that there is no turning back. As the night stretched on and the lights dimmed, the tension in the restaurant lingered, leaving behind an unforgettable shock, the irreversible impact of the truth being exposed. The manager stood firm, scanning the faces in the room, as if engraving every detail of this moment into the memory of all present. Rachel, despite her desperate attempts at explanation, could not conceal the shame and terror filling her eyes. She stood powerless against the truth's weight, dwarfed by the formidable presence of the man she had so carelessly dismissed. In that heavy, silent space, David returned to his seat, but the air around him had irrevocably changed. His gaze, though calm, now carried an icy edge of decisiveness and authority, a silent declaration that, no matter how many mistakes were made, the truth would always be upheld by the eternal values of respect and integrity. Every person who had witnessed this moment understood that no one could escape the illumination of truth. No matter how many layers of arrogance they wrapped themselves in, time seemed to freeze in that moment, as everyone, from the staff to the most distinguished guests, was engulfed in a silence laden with fate's unrelenting weight. The manager's revelation had not only shaken the atmosphere of the restaurant, but it also forced every heart and mind to ponder. In a world where prejudice and arrogance often prevail, was there still room for genuine human worth to be honored? As the restaurant's lights gradually dimmed, and every whisper, every glance still hung in the air, the truth had been fully unveiled, leaving no room for deception. The events of this night, from the smallest signs to the eruption of emotions and internal conflicts, had now reached their climax. A moment where no character could hide their true self any longer. Rachel, burdened by the remnants of her past arrogance, now stood among the shattered pieces of her self-esteem, tormented by an undeniable reality. David, without uttering a word, had spoken volumes through his gaze, a silent promise that, no matter the prejudices or insults endured, a person's true worth would always be safeguarded by the light of truth. In the grandeur of the luxurious restaurant, after hours of mounting tension, David Beckham suddenly rose from his seat. The shimmering lights reflected off his composed yet piercing expression. Every gaze in the restaurant turned toward him, as if the entire room was waiting for a decisive moment, a turning point from which there would be no return. The atmosphere froze. Hushed whispers faded into a heavy silence, all converging upon the instant when David was about to speak. David walked toward Rachel with slow but unwavering steps. His eyes, filled with both disappointment and firmness, carried an unspoken message that every action bears consequences and every word spoken holds the weight of responsibility. As he stood directly before Rachel, the once confident and arrogant waitress now reduced to an image of unease, he did not need to raise his voice or express anger. Instead, in a deep yet steady tone, he asked, "Rachel, can you explain to me what you were thinking when you acted that way?" David's words echoed through the quiet restaurant, affirming the necessity of honesty and respect. Rachel's silence stretched for a few seconds, giving her a chance to grasp the gravity of his words. Her eyes flickered across the faces around her, as if realizing that this was no longer her game alone. Every gaze, from the customers, the waitstaff, even the manager, was fixed upon her, waiting for an answer. Yet Rachel remained still, her lips trembling, unable to utter a single word. David gently reiterated, "In the service industry, the way we treat customers reflects our own values. I didn't come here just to enjoy a meal, but to experience respect and sincerity from those who serve. Tonight, your attitude has shattered that trust." His words were like a key unlocking the door to an invaluable lesson. There was no need for scolding or humiliation. With just a few measured yet weighty sentences, David conveyed a truth: that professionalism and respect are not commodities to be bought or ignored. His firmness not only illuminated the reality of the situation, but also seemed to cleanse the space around them with a renewed belief in human values. Rachel felt her heart tighten. She lowered her gaze, her eyes clouded with remorse and self-reproach. Every word David spoke echoed in her mind like a wake-up call, pulling her from the haze of her own arrogance. In that moment, she realized that no matter how hard she had tried to cultivate an image of a confident and professional waitress, every action carried a responsibility to the truth. The once lively sounds of the restaurant seemed to dissolve into nothingness, leaving only the heavy thud of her own heartbeat. David continued, his voice still carrying the calmness of a man who understood forgiveness and faced reality. There are times when arrogance and quick judgment can obscure a person's authenticity. I didn't come here to cause trouble. I only sought the respect I deserve. Take time to reflect on what you've done and what you feel, because this lesson will help you grow in your career. His words did not need to be elaborate. Each syllable was like a healing remedy, opening a door for Rachel toward newfound awareness. She stood there, the gleam of self-importance in her eyes fading, replaced by confusion and deep regret. She now understood that her actions had not only tarnished her own reputation, but had also been a reflection of how she perceived those around her. After David's words, the atmosphere in the restaurant grew even heavier with silence. Rachel, after a long moment of quiet, suddenly lowered her head, her eyes brimming with regret. She slowly stepped closer to David, not speaking until she finally looked up. Her voice, soft yet filled with sincerity, broke the silence. "I'm sorry, I made a mistake." That apology was not just a string of words. It carried the weight of all the pain and remorse of someone who had come to recognize the greatest failure of her career. In Rachel's eyes, the once bright spark of pride had faded, replaced by sorrow and the painful acceptance of reality. She realized, in that very moment, that everything she had believed about herself, her confidence, her arrogance, and the identity she had built upon prejudice, had now crumbled into meaningless fragments, leaving behind nothing but regret. The customers who had witnessed the entire event remained silent. They said nothing, but their eyes held a deep sense of understanding and admiration for David's handling of the situation. Without raising his voice or demanding retribution, David had led Rachel away from her arrogance, away from her delusions, with nothing more than a few calm words. His presence, his unwavering composure, and his authoritative yet gentle manner had shown everyone the true value of kindness and professionalism. Rachel stood there, her shoulders trembling as if burdened by the weight of both her past and her uncertain future. She knew that after this moment, she would not only have to face herself, but also the consequences of her unprofessional actions. In the eyes of the manager and her colleagues, she could feel disappointment, sadness, and even a hint of caution. The air around her became suffocating, as if every speck of dust carried a warning that in a world of professionalism, there was no place for arrogance and disrespect. Time seemed to slow as all eyes remained fixed on Rachel, the waitress who was now nothing more than the embodiment of regret and fear in the face of truth. She lowered her head, unable to meet anyone's gaze, and walked away slowly, each step weighed down by the shattered remnants of her lost pride. Inside, the memories of her days of confidence and optimism had now been replaced by self-reproach and deep sorrow. She knew that her actions had not only tainted her own reputation, but could also lead to the very outcome she dreaded most: being fired. The air in the restaurant grew colder, as if every passing second served as a reminder that nothing in life was permanent. The guests, though mere passers-by in this story, respected David's handling of the situation. A man who had confronted the truth with an unshakable calm that left no room for criticism. They no longer saw him merely as a businessman or a restaurant owner, but as a figure of sincerity, kindness, and patience, teaching a valuable lesson in the most dignified way. David sat back in his seat, his gaze never leaving Rachel. He did not say another word. He simply observed, as if waiting to see whether she would rise from this moment of regret or remain trapped within it. His silence spoke of his belief that no matter how grave a mistake, every person had the opportunity to change and redeem themselves, so long as they recognized and learned from their missteps. Meanwhile, Rachel stood in the vast space of the restaurant, feeling an overwhelming loneliness and emptiness within her soul. She knew that in order to continue her career, she would have to confront herself, accept the consequences of her unprofessionalism, and learn from them. She felt the true cost of arrogance, a weight she had once worn with pride but now found unbearable. The restaurant lights dimmed slightly, casting a somber glow over the space, where every footstep and every breath seemed to echo as reminders of the undeniable truth. The customers slowly began to leave, one by one, leaving behind a solemn atmosphere where each person reflected on the real measure of human worth. Was it in flaunting achievements or in humility and mutual respect? At that moment, Rachel felt the full extent of her isolation. She recalled all the times she had boasted, all the moments she had convinced herself she was always right, believing she did not need to listen to anyone's warnings. But now, as all of that crumbled, only regret and self-doubt remained. She realized that in this world, the truth always finds its way to each person, no matter how much they try to conceal or ignore it. A few minutes later, the restaurant manager gently approached Rachel. His voice carried no anger, only a quiet reminder. Rachel, everyone makes mistakes. What matters is that you learn from them and don't repeat them. Those words, though simple, fell like raindrops on her wounded soul, offering a touch of warmth, yet deepening her awareness of her own loneliness. Rachel lowered her head, unable to respond, her eyes blurred with unshed tears as she struggled to hold on to the last shreds of her dignity. She knew that only through this painful realization could she step out from the shadow of her arrogance and rediscover her true self. She now understood that every careless word she had spoken had left wounds that could not be healed unless she truly repented and sought to make amends. David remained silent, an unwavering presence, a mirror for all to reflect upon. He did not need to shout or make grand gestures. His steady gaze and a few well-placed words had been enough to convey the message that truth must always take precedence. His eyes carried the belief that no matter the mistake, if one recognizes it and seeks to correct it, they can still reclaim their true value. The final moments of dinner passed in utter silence. The restaurant gradually emptied, its lights dimming minute by minute, leaving only the echoes of a night filled with revelations. Rachel stood alone in the corner, her heart weighed down by regret and self-rejection. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that every step she took from this point forward would be accompanied by the memory of this night, a reminder of professionalism, respect, and humility. The guests departed, their footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving behind a space filled with an unusual stillness. Meanwhile, David remained seated, his gaze following Rachel, not with pity, but with a quiet, firm understanding. He knew that only through regret could a person truly recognize their mistakes, and only by confronting the truth could they grow. That night, in the dim light of the restaurant, the lesson about the consequences of unprofessional behavior was not merely spoken, it was felt. It was a lesson in honesty, humility, and the power of forgiveness. Everyone who had witnessed that night, whether a passing guest or a staff member cleaning up the last tables, carried away the understanding that truth always prevails, no matter how deeply it is buried. Later, Rachel slowly stepped out of the restaurant, her figure fading into the darkness of the night. She did not know what the future held, but she knew that from this moment on, she had to change. She had to learn to face herself, to accept the consequences of her actions, and to rediscover the person she truly was beneath the layers of pride. That night had left a deep wound in her, but also a source of motivation, one that would guide her toward growth and a deeper understanding of kindness. Meanwhile, David remained seated, his gaze following Rachel's retreating form until she disappeared into the night. He knew that everyone makes mistakes, and that the lesson of humility is the most valuable one. He reminded himself that even in difficult moments like this, truth would always prevail, and that through the wounds of pride, each person could ultimately rediscover themselves. Hours later, as the night faded and the first light of dawn crept through the restaurant windows, the space was left in a state of quiet reflection. The events between Rachel and David had painted a picture in shades of both darkness and hope, a reminder that in life, nothing is permanent. Arrogance may blind a person's path, but only truth can illuminate the way toward growth and compassion. In that silence, Rachel's thoughts grew deeper. She wondered if, after this night, she could ever regain the trust of others, and more importantly, herself. She knew that to make things right, she had to start from within, by acknowledging her mistakes, and valuing the true lessons of life. Regret was not just sorrow. It was the driving force for her to become better, to learn to love and respect both herself and others. And as the final moments of the night stretched on, as if time itself wished to record every emotion, every lesson, Rachel walked forward, alone, contemplative but profoundly changed. In the final moments of the dark night at the luxurious restaurant, everything seemed to slow down, as if even time itself had to bow before the true values of humanity. After a night filled with turmoil, intense confrontations, and harsh words, everything gradually settled, leaving only the lingering scent of wine and the shimmering glow of crystal chandeliers in the air. Everyone present, whether the extravagant guests or the silent staff, felt the weight of a profound message. No one should be too quick to judge others based on appearances, for arrogance can lead to mistakes that are difficult to undo. David Beckham, a man who had weathered countless storms in life, remained as composed as ever, carrying the presence of a true businessman. His gaze always exuded confidence and authority, but tonight it held a contemplative depth, as if he was reflecting on everything that had transpired. As people began to leave, David slowly rose from his seat, quietly tidying up a few small items on the table, details that no one else had noticed. Without a single complaint or reproach, he simply stepped out of the restaurant with the same composed demeanor, as if he had long understood and accepted that in life, one cannot always conceal the truth or ignore one's own mistakes. In stark contrast, Rachel Carter, the waitress who once prided herself on her confidence and arrogance, was now shaken by the weight of her own actions. After her reckless words and thoughtless gestures, she felt the cold sting of judgment from the eyes surrounding her. Every glance, every whisper cut into her pride like a blade, turning her once unwavering self-assurance into shame and regret. In that moment, as the air filled with an overwhelming sense of disappointment and sadness, Rachel lowered her head, her sorrowful eyes brimming with silent tears, realizing how her arrogance had blinded her to the true value of a person. Tonight's story, with its rapid twists and moments of tension, left behind an invaluable lesson for everyone who had witnessed it. The guests, many of whom had initially been captivated only by David Beckham's prestigious image, now quietly recognized that a person's true worth is not defined by outward appearances, but by the qualities within: humility, wisdom, and the ability to navigate challenges with grace. David did not need to assert his power through anger or aggressive words. He demonstrated that true success comes from maintaining inner strength, responding with poise and wisdom, no matter the insults or injustices that come unexpectedly. In the dim glow of the chandeliers, as everyone gradually left the space where preconceived notions had been shattered, the final image etched into their minds was that of David Beckham, departing in quiet dignity. He did not look back, nor did he leave behind any explanations. Only a lasting impression that in this vast world, the truth speaks for itself through actions, not words. His gaze, though silent, carried a message. One should never rush to judge others based on appearance alone, for within every person lies untold stories, unseen struggles, and unspoken hopes. Conversely, the sight of Rachel standing there, her head bowed in shame and regret, became an unspoken warning to anyone who had ever let pride consume them, believing that appearances defined everything. She realized that tonight, she had not only wronged herself, but also every person she had once looked down upon. Her regret was not just a reflection of misplaced arrogance, but also a testament to a profound lesson in human interaction, to respect and appreciate the true worth of others, not merely what is visible on the surface. These reflections spread through the minds of those who had witnessed the night's events, as if each person had silently come to the same realization: that intelligence is not demonstrated through displays of power, anger, or harsh words, but through grace, wisdom, and self-restraint. A truly successful individual does not need to shout or fight. Their actions alone speak for them. David had embodied this through every step he took as he left the restaurant, through every composed glance he cast. As the restaurant doors slowly closed, The air outside was cold, but carried the quiet promise of a new day. The image of David Beckham walking away remained imprinted in the minds of those present. His calm demeanor became a symbol of inner strength, intelligence, and dignity, values that only those who respect others can truly attain. Meanwhile, Rachel, with tear-filled eyes and her head lowered in shame, became a costly lesson for all who had ever let arrogance cloud their judgment of others. Tonight, through all the upheavals and shifting emotions, a powerful message about how to treat others had been conveyed. Do not be too quick to judge people based on appearances, for arrogance can lead to mistakes that are difficult to amend. The truth can never remain hidden forever, and only by conducting oneself with wisdom and preserving one's integrity can a person find the path to lasting success. As the first light of dawn crept through the restaurant's windows, signaling the beginning of a new day, people left with the understanding that tonight had been more than just a chaotic evening. It had been a moment of awakening for everyone involved. David Beckham, with his unwavering composure and confident gaze, had left behind the image of a truly successful person. Someone who did not need to assert power through anger, but through wise actions and steadfast belief in one's own values. Meanwhile, Rachel, with sorrowful eyes and her head bowed in shame, had learned a costly lesson about humility and the importance of respecting those around her. The story ended in silence, yet its message echoed in the minds of all who had been present. That truth always prevails, and only through intelligence, humility, and respect can we overcome mistakes and move toward a brighter, more complete future.